British aid, the second largest aid contribution of any country to dealing with the Syrian crisis. We should be very proud of that effort that we've made.
Tim Farron, was it a mistake to go into Libya?
No, it wasn't. Undoubtedly, we prevented a massacre by doing so. I think the failure to build a sustainable state following our intervention is something that we all have to take responsibility for and recognise, though, as a Liberal Democrat proposal, which is that we have a single security budget, and recognise, as already been said, that the way we avoid conflict is far more important than how we deal with it once it originates.
Well, what difference would a single budget make? How would that help the people who are trying to get into Europe?
The most powerful, well, first of all, we need to understand why they're coming, and as has already been said, the majority of people crossing from Libya, from Libyan ports to the European Union are from other parts of Africa. We're talking about Somalia, Eritrea, northern Nigeria,
sure.
And so there are two ways of looking at this. First of all, we need to deal instantly in a compassionate way and understand that those people, if you were, Andrew, to take your family in those sorts of circumstances, to put people at risk there, your family at risk, in order to achieve some form of a life, well, you would do that under those circumstances in absolute desperation.
Well, we know what the people are doing. We want to know what would you do about it.
Well, we need, first of all, to establish a safe and legal point of crossing. We need to ensure that there are safe routes for refugees, because if we were to manage somehow to prevent the crossings from the Libyan port, then only some other part of northern Africa would open up instead. So dealing with compassion with those people who are desperate for help is the first thing. But the second thing is to recognise that the reservoir of migrants is coming from places which are in upheaval. And so our work across the world, in Africa in particular, in conflict prevention, which is something we have the capacity to do through the world's greatest diplomatic corps, through aid and through military cooperation on the ground. That is a way of being able to reduce the number of migrants seeking to come into Europe in the future.
William Dartmouth, what's your position?
Well, our party opposed the intervention in Libya at the time, back in 2011.
You'd have left us
and I would point out, that's simply your value judgment. That's simply your value judgment. And I would also point out that the Prime Minister went to the United Nations, puffing himself up in his panoply, saying Tripoli and Benghazi are now cities transformed. The fact of the matter is it was a terrible mistake. All three of you, Mr Hammond, Mr Farron and the Labour Shadow Foreign Secretary, all voted in favour of it.
So
and I think that there was a
civil war today in Libya if there hadn't been an intervention?
You've created the British and French intervention has basically created has actually basically destroyed a state.
And the fact Gaddafi. It was a one-man state. Well, he'd been running the country for
42 years, and suddenly you decided to get rid of it.
Patrick
and
Harvie.
The fact of the matter is, it's high time that you were held to account.
Patrick Harvie.
It's perfectly legitimate, of course, to identify one particular mistake, taking military action without a plan for peace. But that's not the only one. Let's remember that it's not so very many years since we saw a UK Prime Minister trying to rehabilitate Gaddafi, hugs in the desert and all of that. There is a lack of consistency which we have to recognise.
But what do you think we should do with what are essentially a new generation of boat people? What should we do?
I'm glad you used the word people there rather than migrants, which is so often used and undermines. Well, I agree with what's been said about the need for safe routes of passage. People have a right to seek help and to seek ways of fleeing persecution, conflict or poverty. That's something that we have
So we should have a safe route for the up to 1 million people who are about to come our way.
The whole of Europe needs a plan for how that migration is going to be managed.
Should we be ready to take 1 million?
In a compassionate manner.
Should we be ready to take up to 1 million that the EU says are ready to come across the Mediterranean?
Well, if it's a question of seeing them arrive safely or seeing them drown in the Mediterranean, I know which side of that debate I'm on. But we need consistency in our dealings.
Well, you tell the rest of us what side you're on. Are you in favour of making room in Europe for an extra 1 million migrants coming across the Mediterranean?
As opposed to seeing them die? Absolutely.
Okay.
No question about it. But we need some consistency with the way that we engage with the policy in the Middle East rather than making things worse, not better.
Should we take in more refugees?
I think, first of all, there is an urgent requirement to meet our moral obligations and restore the search and rescue capability that has been withdrawn in the Mediterranean. I think it is morally indefensible to say people should drown in the seas of the Mediterranean somehow to stop others coming, when all of us on this panel have acknowledged it is a highly complex series of conflicts that are causing people to leave. That does not mean, however, that Europe should have an open door to anybody from Africa or from the Middle East who wants to come here to Europe. In that sense, it seems to me the responsibility responsible course is both to try and support and encourage the work of the UN envoy in Libya, at the same time work effectively across North Africa and indeed the Middle East to try and support people within the region. But we should not withdraw, as this British government apparently supported, the withdrawal of our search and rescue capabilities. So if people have got into boats, they should drown in the waves.
When we had the full Italian search and rescue capability, which the Italians had to pay for them themselves, there were still 170,000 people made it to the European Union. Should we be taking more refugees? For example, asylum seeking recently, the Germans have taken 173,000. The Swedes, with only 10 million people, have taken 75,000. We've taken 31,000. Even Hungary's taken 41,000. Should we take more?
Well, if you know the Dublin Treaty in terms of refugees, the fact is that the country that receives the refugees has the obligation to look after them. And in that sense, that is specifically to avoid a situation where people are trafficked to the border of Europe and are then trafficked again by the very people smugglers we want to oppose across Europe.
It's a simple question, Douglas Alexander. Should Britain take more of these asylum seekers, if that's what they are?
Well, these people are arriving not on British shores but on Italian shores.
That's why Europe-wide response is necessary. The answer is yes, but it has to be done on a Europe-wide basis. And we also need to recognise the causes. Most people don't want to put their lives in their hands, risk death or injury to flee persecution, poverty or conflict. We need to address the causes.
I understand that, but I rather think that solving the problem of Eritrea is beyond even the Green Party.
Well, let's recognise that
what would you do?
No one's going to suggest that there are simple, immediate solutions to this. That's why you need that compassionate human response to the immediate crisis. But we need to stop making problems worse.
This is a complex problem, and we've got to take a multi-layered approach to it. We've got to start in the upstream countries. Our choice is to support refugees close to their place of origin so that they can be a part of the future in their countries when the current problem, civil war, whatever it is resolved. We've got to deal with the traffickers. Of course, we've got to support search and rescue operations in the Mediterranean. Nobody wants to see people drowning in the Mediterranean.
And after we've rescued these people, what do we do with them?
If they're rescued the Italians will be running the operation. They will be landing in Italy.
Andrew, that's a very significant concession by the Foreign Secretary, because one of his own ministers, Banner Hassan-Ali, in the House of Lords said that Britain opposed re-establishing the search and rescue mission because it created pull factors. She said that on October 14th.
It was encouraging the migrants.
Have you now changed the policy?
She was talking about a specific operation.
Why yesterday, when you were in Luxembourg, did the words search and rescue mission not appear in any public statement? Is it now the British government's position to support the immediate re-establishment of search and rescue capability in the Mediterranean?
I am not aware that we made a public statement after the meeting yesterday. The meeting yesterday was paving the way for the leaders' meeting that will take place on Thursday.
But do you support the restoration of a more formidable maritime policy?
Of a more formidable operation on the sea, absolutely, yes.
Back to what was called the Mare Nostrum.
No, Mare Nostrum was an Italian project. The Prime Minister will go to Brussels on Thursday, ready to make a commitment of British support to the Triton operation, which is the current EU-financed operation.
Now, just to be clear, the Triton operation is being run by the European Border Agency out of Warsaw, which last time I looked is not that near.
And it has no search and rescue mandate.
And has got peanuts for a budget compared to the Mare Nostrum.
Just worth remembering.
Quickly, then I want Bridget.
Christian Aid have said this morning that they believe that the search and rescue operation needs to be restarted within 48 hours. The 800
and you
people,
support that?
Absolutely. The 800 people who lost their lives, children, women and men, over the weekend. There was another 700 who've died already, absolutely. Thousands died last year. And if we don't intervene now, it's been an absolute humanitarian crisis.
All right.
Just to clarify, Foreign Secretary, Britain was among those EU countries who argued that the EU search and rescue mission would just encourage more migrants and make the problem worse, and therefore it should be stopped. Are you now recognising that that was a wrong decision?
On the operation of Mare Nostrum, the Italian Mare Nostrum programme, we, along with many other EU countries, expressed concerns about the way the programme was operating. The question was whether we recognise that there is a need for additional support now on the sea, and we do.
A lot more people have died since you voted to stop it.
We didn't vote to stop anything. The Italians unilaterally decided to end
because the rest of Europe wouldn't pony up the money to help them pay for it. 9 million euros a month.
The Prime Minister will go to Brussels on Thursday, willing to support an enhanced operation on the Mediterranean.
Let's just look at Syria, where we didn't intervene. partly, largely because of Labour. Now, Mr Miliband boasted that he stood up to the leader of the free world over Syria in one of the television debates. But the fact is, David Cameron agreed to all the conditions for military intervention that Mr Miliband gave, and then the Labour whips told them there was too much unrest on the Labour backbenches. It was Diane Abbott he couldn't stand up to, not Barack Obama.
No, that's not true. And actually, when Phillip said earlier that you'd abolished sofa government, I was actually in the room with Ed Miliband, David Cameron, your predecessor William Hague, indeed. Nick Clegg and David Cameron and William Hague were sitting on the self-same sofa. Frankly, I don't know what the National Security Council was doing, because the truth is, in those fateful days in the middle of August 2013, there was not the basic lessons learned from Iraq that required to be learned. The evidence should precede the decision. That it should go to the United Nations. There should be a vote at the United Nations, which was one of the conditions.
Right, which Mr Cameron said yes.
One of the conditions of our amendment. Secondly, that there should be compelling evidence from the weapons inspectors.
And he said he would wait for the report.
Thirdly, that the implications for the regions and time limit on the military action should be put forward.
And he agreed to that too?
No, what he did agree to was military action the following weekend. We said there would need to be specific terms and conditions. And frankly, Andrew, it was open to David Cameron, even at 5 minutes.
Politics.
Please
with
let
Britain's
me finish the point,
international
Phillip.
reputation.
It was open to David Cameron to accept the Labour amendment. If your point is true, Andrew, why didn't he simply accept the Labour amendment and then it would have passed the House of Commons?
Labour used to talk about an ethical foreign policy. What's ethical about allowing ISIS full sway to torture and massacre innocent Syrians? Where's the moral authority in that, and while we stand by and do nothing?
Well, we're not standing by and do nothing. We're part of an international coalition confronting
Not
ISIL.
in Syria, we're not.
No, we're not, and that's because we were invited. No,
because of Labour.
Because we were invited. Well, actually, the vote at the time of August 2013 was not to confront ISIL. It was specifically in relation to chemical weapons. And anybody who suggests now that it was somehow directed towards ISIL is talking nonsense. The fact is, we are part of an international coalition confronting ISIL at the request of a democratically elected Iraqi government, with a ground force component, including the Peshmerga, the Iraqi security forces. Sadly, those conditions do not apply in Syria, but it is the case that that international coalition, including a number of Sunni countries, are themselves engaged in military action in Syria.
There's nothing ethical about not being in Syria, though, is there?
Well, there's
just pure pragmatism in your point.
No, it's not pure pragmatism. There's a question as to what can actually be achieved. And in that sense, confronting ISIL at the request of the Iraqi government, we judge as a meaningful and important contribution to confronting ISIL both in the region and internationally.
I want to take a different tack on this, if I may. Do you not recognise, Douglas, that what happened in Parliament over Syria has hugely diminished Britain's status in the world, hugely diminished
I can't accept
the sense of reliability
I can't
among
accept
our allies.
responsibility for the conduct of the Conservative government.
Because it was what
because
Labour
you suggest
did in
that this is somehow about the character of our country. What happened in August 2013 told me a great deal more about the competence of your government.
I must say that I think that what the debate on Syria showed more than anything else was that the impact of the Iraq war, supported by Labour and Conservatives, has left a legacy. And it's left a legacy that British politicians, the British public, are reluctant to take action, even when action is justified. I'm proud that my party stood up against the Iraq war. I'm equally proud that my party stood up in favour of intervention in Kosovo. It's about doing what is wise in the interests of those people who need us the most.
All right, I want to end this particular section with a question from Bridget.
OK, it's a question to all or everyone, or some on the panel, which is because we're talking about Britain's place in the world, and all British politicians like to talk about Britain punching above its weight as a global leader. But
not the metaphor I would choose to use, I have to admit.
OK, all right. And maybe not all politicians. But what would you say to those who say Britain should recognise that there have been geopolitical shifts, which mean there are other players who are bigger, the number of security challenges are escalating and getting more complex, and the appetite here in the UK for interventions is less than it was. So maybe politicians should temper their rhetoric and reconcile themselves to Britain actually just being a medium-sized country that has to curl its ambitions and be more selective about what it does and not think it can do all this.
Well, there have been so many ill-thought-out interventions, not just from the coalition, but from Tony Blair as well, at the concept of intervention in this country has been rather discredited, and we're very much against it, and we also think the House of Commons should be brought into the proposition much sooner. Well, the coalition government has already settled for second-class status by spending less than 2% on defence.
I'm asking for your view.
Yes, they put all these obligations on the British military, whilst cutting defence, and aren't even prepared to accept.
What is your view? Do we settle for second-class status or not?
It depends how you define second-class status.
All right, Tim
We're
Farron,
in second-class status within the European
all
Union.
right. Bridget defined it. Tim Farron.
Well, the world is changing, and our response to that world ought to change as well.
Okay.
We're right as a coalition government, and I think with cross-party agreement to withdraw our army from Germany, for example, we'd be wrong to spend £100 billion on a like-for-like replacement of Trident.
Right, but should we settle for second-class status and